So let me. There we go. So I'm going to give a few minutes for people to get in.
I'm just a talking head today. I don't have any PowerPoint.
Nope. It's just basically a Q&A today. So it'll just be a discussion. Give a few more minutes for people to come in, and then we'll get started because we have an hour and we have a lot of things to talk about in that time.
Oh, this is nice. This is like breathe time.
It is. It is.
I should do this every day.
Like, I feel like we should have some mindfulness before we get started. This is probably the quietest room I've been in like for the whole week so far. So. So what I'll do is I will just go ahead and get started. As people join, they will join. And of course, we will have the recording for people who want to watch it later on. So I'll just go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Karen Wilson. For those who don't know me, I'm the founder of ChildNEXUS, and we are a digital platform that connects parents whose kids are struggling with learning, processing, or social emotional challenges with information, as well as providers who can support them and provide services to their kids and support families. And today we have with us a panel of our ChildNEXUS members and community members as we've transitioned back to school in August and September for most kiddos. And, you know, we're still in a pandemic, and we've had a lot of people asking questions and calling and saying that, you know, we're concerned about our kids having lost ground over the last year and a half. We're concerned about their mental health. We want to know, you know, where they are right now. And so that's kind of the state of affair of things right now, is that we're kind of watching to see how our kids are doing, how they're responding to this new academic year. Some are in person for the first time in over a year, and progress reports are coming out, and parents are concerned about, you know, what should they be looking for in progress reports? Is this what they should expect given the last year and the fact that we were in a pandemic for almost 2 years going on now? It's hard to believe that it's almost 2 years. And when is it appropriate to ask for additional support? How do you go about doing that? When should you be concerned? And so I talked to some of my colleagues, and we've got a great panel of experts with us today. I'm so excited that we have Dr. Nicole Michaeli. She's a pediatric clinical psychologist. We have Lizeth Sandoval, who is an educational therapist, and we have Heather Zakson, who is an educational attorney. And we are here to answer questions that have been posed already, and then also to take questions from people who are on the call today and are concerned about their kids or kids that they're working with and want some questions answered. And so that's what we're going to do. So first of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists for giving up your evening to answer some questions and to help some folks out in terms of what's happening. So thank you. Thank you all.
Pleasure.
So let's just start. Let's kick things off. I'm going to stop sharing so that we can actually see each other. And I really want to kind of think about, where we are right now. Parents have got some progress reports, or they've got some verbal feedback from teachers about how their kids are doing. And, I've heard from a lot of parents that teachers are saying, well, it's probably due to the pandemic. It's probably they'll catch up. When should parents be concerned? And what should they be looking for first in those progress reports? Dr. Michaeli, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Thank you so much for inviting me, Karen. I'm so happy to be here. And yeah, I think this is such an important topic right now. As you mentioned, most kids have been learning remotely for the past year and a half and just returned to school, either the end of last year or this fall, and many of them with a hybrid model, so part-time. And so before I jump into what to look for, I just wanted to go over sort of where we are in terms of what's been happening. And so, in terms of my work as a pediatric psychologist, many of the things I see are, regularly in a typical situation are things like learning disorders, attention disorders, processing problems. But what we're seeing now in the, since the pandemic is sort of new concerns that have been brought about regarding learning loss. And we've heard that word a lot. And essentially that refers to any either general or specific loss of skills, or it could be a reversal in academic achievement that's happened. And it usually happens in response to some sort of gap in education. And so before we talked about this when there was like, a child that missed a lot of school or summer break, but now this has been researched in response to the pandemic. And so what the research tells us is that there's actually been this significant learning loss, and that the rate of the loss, from what some research shows, seems to be actually equivalent to the period that schools have been closed, or that students have been learning remotely. And so the implication of this is that the longer the closures, the school closures, the more the potential for learning loss. And so this is why this is such an important topic to think about when we're thinking about our kids learning and them returning back to school. And so, we've seen losses in academic areas like reading and reading fluency and math, and even in like standardized test scores for students. We know that the losses aren't just academic, but there are also implications on children and adolescents' mental health. So another thing to think about, and so the pandemic has been associated with, for many kids, a lot of increased worry and stress, and feelings of hopelessness, and overall just anxiety and depression when you talk about just clinically, and then behavioral issues. For some kids and teens, this can look like different risky behaviors, substance abuse. So those are just to name a few in terms of the social and emotional impact of the pandemic. So it's really not just academic that we're talking about.
Yeah, and I love that you talked about the social emotional impact, because some parents will say that their kids actually did better remotely, and the anxiety has now come from having to go back to school. And so for each child, it's going to be different.
Right.
So Heather, I wanted to ask you, because the school district has invited some families to meet to discuss compensatory services. And, I think parents are wondering what that is. And what does that mean in terms of getting support for your child? Can you talk a little bit about what that would mean in the context of kind of what Dr. Michaeli was saying?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And thanks so much for including me on the panel so that I can address this question and other questions, I hope. In general, compensatory services would be services to sort of put something back, right? Something that's been missing. And how are we going to kind of go back and fill in that gap? So it can mean a lot of things. I mean, there is sort of a term of art in the law, compensation for something that's been lost that a person has a legal right to. And so for students who have an IEP, they have a legal right to, we talk about a lot of faith, a free and appropriate public education. A child's IEP for a child who needs special education, who has a disability that impacts their education, that's been identified and where an IEP has been developed. Compensatory services means making up for where those appropriate levels of support haven't been provided. And it's something that we very frequently talk about when I'm working with families with children who have IEPs or who need IEPs, that where they haven't been served properly in the past, the school district needs to provide compensatory services or sometimes compensatory reimbursements, where the family has sort of filled in that gap themselves by purchasing, therapies, educational therapy, speech therapy, occupational therapy. Compensatory can be compensatory reimbursements, but where we're looking at a child and we're seeing gaps in their development because they haven't been appropriately supported, then compensatory services are to fill in those gaps.
You're on mute, Karen.
Of course I am. As we talk about compensatory services, I think one of the things that comes to mind is tutoring. And there's a difference between tutoring and educational therapy, which you mentioned. I'd love for Lizeth, for you to kind of chime in on the difference between those things, because sometimes parents are offered support in terms of a teacher meeting with a student before school or working with a tutor, and then other parents will pursue educational therapy. And those are very different things in terms of levels of support. For those people who may not be familiar with educational therapy and how that might differ from tutoring, if people are offered, a compensatory intervention that involves tutoring, could you speak a little bit about that, Lizeth?
Yes, and thank you, Carrie, for letting me be part of this panel. And just to talk a little bit more about the difference between educational therapy and tutoring, I will say a skilled tutor has clear knowledge about a specific subject or content area, and they really focus on teaching that subject. Their credentials or bachelor's or master's, they can be on any level. They don't have a specific requirement. And they also assist with homework, and their goal is to help them achieve a higher grade on an exam or a final. Whereas an educational therapist, you have to have a background in either psychology, learning disabilities, special education, learning difficulties, and you either have a master's in educational therapy or you have a certificate in educational therapy. And as an educational therapist, you really are trained to serve as a resource for parents and families. You also receive additional training in assessments, interventions, collaboration, advocacy, and case management. And you serve as a case manager for that child. And what it looks like is your constant communication with families, teachers, anyone that's working with the child, and you're really ensuring that everyone's talking to each other in order for the child to make progress. So you become almost like the voice for the child and helping them achieve goals that they need to get to. And along the way, you really are building on the skills and strategies that they need to eventually move from dependent to independent. So those are like the main difference between educational therapy and a tutor.
Yeah, and I think that's
Can I-
really important
I
in
ask
terms
you-
of, oh, sorry, go ahead, Heather.
I just wanted to ask Lizeth to talk a little bit about how educational therapists can help children with executive functioning.
Oh, that's a good
I
one.
think parents are hearing a lot about that. It's a term that's kind of now a little bit in fashion. You know, it's dropped into assessments, and school psychologists or teachers will talk about, oh, well, you know, their executive functioning is, but you know, lacking or something. And what does that mean? And that's an area that I've found for my clients that education therapists can really can make a huge difference, where tutors certainly won't, and teachers don't really either. I mean, they don't have the chops, but you do.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Heather. That's actually a really good point. So just to simplify a little bit, executive functionings are like the brain-based skills that require us to do our daily tasks at home, at school, and at work. And it has been a term that it's getting, people are hearing it more and more. And it's basically the skills that a child needs to be able to function. And as an educational therapist, we are trained in understanding how learning takes place in the brain, and really understanding how executive functioning play a role in the learning process of a child. And this includes task initiation, sustain attention. Are they able to work on a project and for a longer time? Are their working memory? Organization is a big one that I see a lot in middle school and high school students. Flexibility, planning and prioritizing, and time management. And I do want to say, as the students begin progressing from middle school to high school, you really start to notice students in middle school that are starting to fall behind, where they might not be turning in the homework, or they do the homework, but they don't turn it in. They don't hit submit. And it's because in middle school, you really start to notice that this is the first time that children have multiple teachers. They have to figure out how each teacher wants their homework turned in. They have to figure out how to plan for extracurricular activities. When are they going to do their homework? When are they going to study? And it can seem very overwhelming for a child. And as an educational therapist, this is something that is part of our work. We help break it down and work one skill at a time, so that it becomes more manageable for that child.
And that's so important. I know, Dr. Michaeli, you see a lot of kids who are struggling with executive functioning, and some have had a diagnosis of ADHD. We know that kids with ADHD often have significant difficulties with executive functioning, but we see it in kids who do not have a diagnosis of ADHD as well. And I know and when we're making referrals, educational therapists have been extremely helpful in helping kids address those executive functioning difficulties. But I love that you talked about the fact that you work on building skills and you help kids develop strategies, because we have also seen a lot of kids who were during the pandemic were supposed to be learning to read and that reading did not come on board. And we also know that kids in kindergarten, first grade, that's typically when kids who are at risk for a specific learning disorder in reading or dyslexia are identified. And so now we're at that point where, you know, parents and teachers are wondering, is this because they didn't get a formal reading, you know, instruction? They were at home, they were getting half day, hybrid, they didn't get a good instruction? Or is this a kid who, if he or she was in a regular instruction classroom, would not have picked it up because there's a neurobiological reading disorder that was already there? And I think that has created some confusion and some anxiety for a lot of parents and educators, because if it is a reading disorder, it is dyslexia, you want to intervene early and you don't want to have a wait and see approach. But I think people are kind of trying to figure out, is this really an underlying dyslexia that was already always there, or is this due to the pandemic?
You know, I've been talking so much about reading intervention, and
Yes.
Karen, you and I have had this
Yes.
discussion before. I'm kind of evangelical about reading,
I am too.
effective reading, literacy education, literacy training right now. And one of the kind of magical things to realize is that good reading instruction is the same thing for kids with dyslexia and kids without dyslexia. The thing is that kids with dyslexia are going to need more of it, more intensely, maybe for a longer period of time, because there are neurobiological, I don't know, I'm not a psychologist, but there's things in there that are blocked, that are impeding their ability to sort of operationalize that instruction. But that the foundational reading skills, right? There are like 5 parts to it. It's phonics and phonological awareness and vocabulary and comprehension, and there's one more piece. But those fundamental pieces are the same for all children. And so if we had effective reading instruction happening, systemic evidence-based reading instruction happening in all the schools, parents, I'm encouraging all the parents out there, like, go in and like knock down doors. Like, we need effective reading intervention for all of our kids. And particularly now we're seeing after the pandemic, right? The kids who would have fallen a little bit behind are like way behind. And even kids who might have been able to kind of, I don't know, osmosis, like absorb some reading skills, they're behind too. And so we know how to teach reading. And Lizeth, I know she knows how to teach reading.
Right.
We can be doing this in schools too.
Yes, absolutely. And so Dr. Michaeli, I mean, this is an important question. You're going to have parents who are going to come to you who are going to want an assessment because they want to know, how, do I need a formal reading, evidence-based reading intervention? Or is this something that my child, wasn't on Zoom, didn't have their camera on, wasn't learning, wasn't picking up. And if they have that proper instruction, they would get it. So how do you decide, who needs this intervention? How do parents know?
Right. That's a great question. And part of it comes, I think, identifying the issue comes with having a really good comprehensive evaluation. And what a comprehensive evaluation does is look at all of the child's cognitive abilities, their academic abilities, and all of their brain skills, or what we would refer to as their neuropsychological functioning. So their attention, their memory, their language processing, their attention and executive functioning, and their social and emotional functioning. And we do this by using, one-on-one tests individually with the child or the adolescent, using evidence-based tests, as well as collaborating with parents, teachers, professionals working with the child, or any adults that know the child. And so it's really a collaborative process where we're pulling all these pieces gathering all these pieces of information to better understand not just what that child's profile is, but also, as you said, is this something that can it be attributed to this situation and the current changes in our education system, or is this something that is more neuropsychological and brain-based? And so some of the I would say tips or things for parents to be aware of is this something where, if there is, in the case of, for example, a reading difficulty, is this something where the child always struggled, even pre-pandemic, and sort of not just in terms of grades, but some red flags are like, would they avoid reading, reading assignments, but they would happily do their other homework? Or for younger kids, sometimes we see this as in the form of tantrums, kids throwing tantrums when they need to do even a small, if they have to read a small book or a short book. Things like that could indicate difficulties before the pandemic, even on the mild side, could indicate that this is something that's more longstanding. And in terms of a situation where it'd be more situational, or the learning loss would be comparing how that child did before in previous grades, you know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, compared to how they're doing now. So has there been this drastic change or a significant change in how they're doing in across subjects? So we've seen kids who, for example, were always, you know, always did well in math, no problems. And then over the last several months, we see this drop in their grade, especially as they've returned to in-person learning. And so we want to, you know, really look at that and understand what, you know, and sort of be on the lookout for a potential loss in their skills, and then being able to intervene in the areas that they need it the most.
Right.
Yeah.
And you, I mean, you mentioned, you know, a comprehensive evaluation, and, you know, some parents who are in public schools will say that their child was supposed to have an IEP evaluation pre-pandemic and it never happened. Heather, I'd love for you to speak about what those parents can do, because it seems like there are a lot of parents who have been waiting for a long time. Some were told initially that they're not doing them. And, you know, what can they do? What can parents do if they're concerned?
Yeah, I could talk for the whole hour about what I'm hearing, but I won't. Okay, so parents should know there was no suspension of special education legal rights and entitlements during the pandemic. And everybody was really kind and patient and you know, waiting for schools to be able to sort of put things together and okay, but you know, we know how to do this stuff. And schools have a whole staff of people whose job it is to get this all done. And there was no waiver of rights. There was no suspension of entitlements. So if your child was supposed to have an assessment, that assessment is due or overdue. That IEP was supposed to be held, now it's due or overdue. If they were supposed to have identified your child, you know, if they were doing that first assessment if they started in January or February of 2020 and it just like evaporated, like it never happened, that is well overdue. There's so much that goes into that, and there's so much that goes into talking about like, what do you do now? But I would encourage parents to talk with a professional at any level of the field, right? If you're working with an education therapist or even a tutor, hopefully that person is knowledgeable about their end of the process and can connect with, like Lizeth knows me and Lizeth knows Nicole and Karen. And so, and Nicole knows to refer to Lizeth or to refer to me if there's, because we all work in, you know, in different roles in this. My job is to help families to improve their children's educational program through the public schools and to get the public schools to provide the funding and the level of services that they should be. And now there's a whole lot of catch up that has to be done.
Yeah. And Heather, I'd love for you to also add about parents' rights to an IEE, like an independent evaluation if they don't agree with the IEP. Because a lot of parents don't know about that.
So at the very, you know, at the threshold, when a parent asks for support, that if you say, my child is struggling and needs help, the school district should assess. They shouldn't say no. If you say, I want my child evaluated, there's really no reason for the school district to say no. Oh, we'll do an SSPT. Oh, we'll do some, you know, intervention and see how they respond to intervention. None of that should get in the way of starting the assessment, and they can do all their intervention and check the response to intervention while they're assessing, right? So they shouldn't say no. And the school district will do their assessment. A school psychologist should do what they call a psychoeducational assessment, and then they should meet with you and present the results of that assessment. And if you feel like they didn't get it, they don't get your child, they didn't get it right, trust your instincts. And you can ask the school district for an independent assessment, sort of like a tiebreaker, right?
Mhm.
We need an independent voice, not from me, not from the school, an independent professional who can come in and offer an expert perspective on what my child needs. You know, like any question, right? A school district
Mhm.
might say no, that gets complicated. And I would encourage you again to seek out professional support at any level. And
Mhm.
when, when you need an attorney to help you with that, Nicole or Karen or Lizeth will know to refer you to, and it doesn't have to be me. I mean, there are a number of qualified attorneys. But when you get that independent assessment, that's something that Nicole or Karen can provide. That's their level of expertise where they can come in and do a deeper dive,
Mhm.
a more, both a more, broad, comprehensive and a more detailed, sort of deeper assessment of what's going on with your child and why
Mhm.
their learning is impeded, right? Why they can't manage to make it work.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point because, the reason we do evaluations is really to understand why a child is struggling and to write a plan that addresses the area of difficulty. And the purpose of a school-based assessment, I think I often tell parents, is to identify whether or not a child qualifies for services. So there's two different reasons for doing the evaluation. Our approaches are going to be different. And, oftentimes when we're doing these evaluations, I'm often making recommendations regarding educational therapy because so many of the kids, like we mentioned before, need an evidence-based reading intervention. They need intervention for executive functioning because part of the reason why they're not getting their work done is because they just can't, they're not organized well enough to get it done, or it takes them so long to get started that by the time everyone else is done, they're just started and now it's time to close their books and they haven't got their work done. And can you now I know Lizeth, you talked about the work that you do, but I'm talking about getting educational therapy services for kids who might not be in independent schools or might be in public schools. How do you get them, school districts, to approve educational therapy as an intervention?
I would say that's when Heather comes in.
Because it makes such a
Definitely.
big difference. I mean, it's such a significant difference in the improvement that kids can make when they get the right intervention.
So
And I was
no,
going
go.
to add
Yeah.
with that.
Talk, Lizeth. Talk about what you do.
And I was going to add with that, and like the work that Dr. Karen and Dr. Nicole do really show me when I start seeing a client where I need to start working with that child and where the intervention needs to take place. And then I also do informal assessments to really break down the academic tasks of where is the underlying issue happening, and really focusing on those and building that. But I was going to say, usually with the district, someone like Heather gets supports the family with getting compensatory time for that child, and that is a way that I can also help the families that are in a public school.
And someone asked a question, Heather, I don't know if now's the right time, but they asked, what is the difference between an SST and an IEP?
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Big difference. For one thing, an SST is just like a parent-teacher conference with a name, with a piece of paper that like really it doesn't have any more significance than the people who hold it want to give. But an IEP, that's a legal document. An IEP carries with it legal entitlements and enforcement mechanisms and legal procedural safeguards, a right to due process when aspects of that program are denied or delayed. So you're in a completely different framework when you're having an SST and you're just sort of sitting down for a conference and talking about what it might be nice if teachers did this or that for your child. Or if you have an IEP where there's a requirement, an affirmative requirement on the school district, an affirmative obligation to provide your child an appropriate educational program. So yeah, I think it's often presented to parents as sort of a, oh, you know, maybe you'd like an SST, or maybe you'd like a 504 plan, or maybe you'd like an IEP. Those are very different, very different, very different frameworks. And it's also, it's not sequential. I don't think when we hear this from a principal or from a teacher, I don't think they're lying. I think this is how school districts organize the work for their administrators, right? But almost invariably, it's presented to parents that, oh, well, first we're going to have an SST and see if that works. And then maybe we'll try a 504 plan and see if that works. And then if all that doesn't work, then we're going to try an IEP. But it's not sequential. If a child has learning disabilities that impact their learning, and they need specialized instruction and services to support them so that they can access their learning, then they need an IEP, and they always have needed it. And if they don't, right, if we assess and we determine, oh, well, there is no underlying disability, then okay, then let's, you know, try an SST. But it shouldn't be a sequential, you know, sort of checklist that families are put through. Kids can lose years of time, years going through that. You know, we do 2-3 SSTs, then we try the 504, and that's lost time that they'll never get back.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that, Heather, that you're right. If the process does end up being sequential and that child really needed early intervention, you know, we know that kids, when they're younger, they respond so well to intervention because of that neuroplasticity of their brain being so receptive to interventions. And so when they miss that window, or when time goes by and they don't get that intervention because they haven't gotten the IEP, it becomes much harder to make that progress.
Yeah, and I often talk about that in terms of reading, and we're coming back to reading again, Heather.
Yeah.
But because, you know, when kids are young, they're learning to read, and you wait for them to learn to read, and then by 3rd grade, oftentimes end of 2nd, they're reading to learn. And if you're in 3rd grade, 4th grade, and you still can't read, then how are you supposed to access social studies and your geography, you know, and your science textbook, and, you know, in your math textbook?
Right. Word problems. And I see kids start to feel like, oh, school's not for me. You know, I'm just not a student. That's just not my thing. That's just not what I do well. I mean, talk about pandemics. You know, there is a pandemic of lost educational opportunity happening as well. And I don't think schools are set up to stem that pandemic. I think parents need to get up and organize and, you know, work on behalf of their children, and also communicate with each other about what's working and what's not. And I want to talk about compensatory education and that also about this, because listen, schools are already filling up 6 hours a day for the kids, right? So if they're talking to us about compensatory, oh, we're going to provide compensatory services for what we have, you know, what we missed for the past 1.5 years or 2 years, how are they going to fit that into the 6-hour school day? They're not. Let me tell you, like, they're not. Teachers are already wrung out. They're maxed out as it is. That compensatory education, and I'm sorry for children who are missing, you know, that really that's extra time that children have to find in their schedules too. But unless we do some fairly radical restructuring of the school day, which I don't see happening, I mean, real compensatory services like what Lizeth offers, like what Nicole and Karen, the kinds of interventions that you identify when you're assessing children, that is not going to be offered during the school day. That's not something that they can do in like 15 minutes, you know, between, you know, PE and computer lab.
Yeah, and that's often hard for parents to kind of wrap their heads around, because they're trying to fit it into a school day. And we know, particularly with kids who need a more intense intervention in order to see improvements in things like reading, they need the time to be able to dedicate to that type of intervention.
But there's payoff for that down the line,
So much payoff.
especially with little guys.
Yeah.
You know,
Mhm.
there's payoff down the line when, as they get older and get to be teenagers and, you know, want to be doing more and more stuff, the earlier they get the intervention. Don't give up on teenagers. I mean,
Right.
teenagers should totally benefit from stuff like that.
Absolutely.
but-
And then also when you delay, you not only, you know, lose that opportunity for that early intervention, you know, brain plasticity rewiring, but then the longer kids struggle, it increases the likelihood that they're going to experience anxiety and depression. And, you know, Dr. Michaeli was talking about their greater risk for substance use, their greater risk for disengagement, for wanting to leave school, not working hard at school because they just think they're not good students.
Right, right. And that mindset, you bring up a good point, which is the mindset. And so when they struggle, that can shape the mindset and the way that they view their skills and abilities. And so sometimes when kids struggle, they start to think that they can't do it, or they have these negative or distorted thoughts that are then going to impact the way that they actually perform. And so it ends up being that their performance is not actually a reflection of their ability, but it's a reflection of their mindset. And so it sort of becomes a vicious cycle of this negative mindset, poor performance, and they just, it's kind of cycles down. And so I think it's important for parents to be checking in with kids, you know, how they're doing, what their mood is, you know, how they're feeling about school, and be monitoring it. And then if there are concerns, you know, talking to a professional, you know, about possible interventions like therapy.
And I think, you know, oh, go ahead.
I was going to add to that. In my practice, when I'm working with clients as they get older, middle school and high school, they do create they think that they're not good at it, or they just can't learn. And part of my work is really getting them from that fixed mindset to growth mindset, and walking them through and like undoing all those years that they didn't get the support at a younger age. And they can still get the support. It just takes a little bit longer because we have to undo what they think of themselves already.
Right.
Yeah, and we see that a lot too, in terms of, you know, the social emotional difficulties that students have alongside the learning struggles because of, you know, the lack of intervention at the appropriate time, or a delayed intervention because people thought they would just catch up. And, you know, we've been talking a little bit about anxiety, and there's been a lot of pandemic related anxiety. But there's also been pushback against this whole notion of learning loss, because everybody lost ground during the course of the pandemic. And we don't want to increase the anxiety of all students by kind of perseverating on the learning loss narrative. But we also need to keep in mind that there are some students who had issues before the pandemic. And like we said earlier, and those issues were exacerbated by the pandemic. And there were also students who were not struggling before, but who were already marginalized, who suffered more than other students because they didn't have access to reliable internet. They didn't have access to, you know, the support systems they would have had in place. They were, you know, didn't have a good, reliable computer. And so we have to kind of balance between putting a blanket learning loss on everyone and creating an unnecessary anxiety, to also realizing that there are some kids who struggled more than others during this time. And they're the ones who really need to focus on. And I think that during the pandemic, you know, the pandemic revealed a lot about our education system in terms of inequities. And we need to also keep in mind that those students who are marginalized and were hurt the most by the pandemic are the ones who need the most support now.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, the research actually does show that the marginalized groups had like much greater learning loss than non-marginalized. So the effect of the loss was much greater for them. And so they do need a lot more support.
Yeah.
And for those parents, Heather, I'm thinking about those parents who may not have had an IEP on their radar before the pandemic. And now they're thinking that their child needs an assessment. From what I'm hearing from you is that they can go in and say, you know, I think my child needs an evaluation and needs, we need to take a closer look at what, to determine what it is that they need in terms of support.
Absolutely. And what's more, if there were any, you know, sort of signs or indications along the way that this child was struggling and maybe needed additional specialized instruction, therapeutic supports like educational therapy, like speech therapy, like occupational therapy, anything to support them that we would consider as part of the, you know, the big umbrella of special education. If there were any indications of that before, and that child now gets evaluated and yes, gets their IEP, the services, the money that parents have spent over the past 2 years, that's the period of time that's covered in special education law, over the past 2 years can even be reimbursed. So we have a participant who had a question about providing private services.
Yes.
You know, it's not fair because so many children can't afford and don't have the resources, but if you can provide what your child needs from your private resources, I would encourage you to do it and pursue what they need from the school district. And if your child has an IEP or ends up getting an IEP, you might have a case for reimbursement for the services that you've been paying for privately going 2 years back.
That's really great information, Heather. And, you know, one of the questions here is from Mary Lee. She says, in the lower performing schools where parents have more difficulty in getting supports and interventions, educational therapy is very difficult to attain. How can they get more support? Is that something that if they have an IEP and it's not recommended, can the parents challenge and say, the intervention that you're recommending isn't sufficient? I think that my child needs educational therapy to address executive functioning, or they need educational therapy that will implement an evidence-based reading intervention.
Absolutely. And no school has a right to cry poor. We shouldn't have low performing schools. That's shocking that we allow ourselves to say, oh, we have like good schools over here and like bad schools over here. Public schools are public schools. They all draw from the same funds. They're all supported by the same system. And so I don't buy it when an administrator says, oh, but our school is so poor. Like our school is so low achieving anyway. I don't buy it. Let me tell you, judges don't buy it either. Right? Children are children across the board, and children need those supports, and those supports are available. Those supports are available. Don't buy it.
And I think, and that's part of one of the reasons why we do this is because a lot of parents don't know or receive bad information, you know, and it's not necessarily from the school. It could be from someone who tried this procedure to go through this before and it didn't work, or don't even bother asking because they don't have money. And this is to let people who are listening know that they have a right to ask and they have a right to challenge what they're given. There's a way to do that. And it's just a matter of realizing that you can do this.
Yeah. I remember when Lizeth and I first met, right? Lizeth, we talked about what a difference that makes to the families you work with, right? Lizeth travels, by the way, Lizeth works bilingual. Spanish and let me sing Lizeth.
Yes, so I also support Spanish speaking families as well, and helping them understand and supporting them through the school process. And Heather, like you said, I remember us having this conversation of how to get those supports for everyone, for
Mhm.
every child.
And that should be the goal, right? I mean, every child is entitled
Mhm.
to
That's
what they
right.
need, right?
That's right.
We've been talking a lot about kind of the academic needs, when students are falling behind in school academically in reading and writing and math, not getting assignments turned in, or not reaching their full potential because of executive functioning difficulties. But there are also a lot of students who struggle with mental health issues, with anxiety, with depression, with school anxiety that impacts their ability to access their curriculum, participate in a school environment. And parents can ask for support for that as well, correct?
Is that a question for me?
Yes. I'm looking at you, but I didn't say your name.
No, I mean, I would encourage families, when you're talking with the school, don't limit yourself.
Mhm.
Don't say no to yourself before you've even presented the
Mhm.
question. What does your child need? And also, if you're working with a professional, they're coming, with a lot of information and a lot of experience, and they'll know, Nicole isn't gonna recommend something that's like not available on this planet, like,
Right.
and that, so trust your experts,
Mhm.
trust your instincts, and when you need more information or support, again, if I think we're so lucky to have the community of
Mhm.
care that we do among providers. We know each other. So if you can touch onto any thread in this web,
Mhm.
your private speech therapist or your private physical therapist or your education therapist or your psychologist or the therapist that's providing emotional support for your child or your attorney, or that, if you can touch onto one of those threads, that'll connect you with the rest. And we love to work together.
We
We
do.
love to coordinate, and we call each other and brainstorm, like, we talk about how better to help kids all the time. And I think if you've become aware that your child needs something, it's
Mhm.
probably not something so exotic that the school doesn't know how to offer it. They
Right.
know how to do it. They have the
Right.
resources. They have deep resources.
And that's really important. And I think one of the things I also want to speak on is that sometimes parents know their child is struggling, but they don't know why. And that's where an evaluation helps, because kids can struggle for a number of different reasons. The struggle can look the same in 3 different kids, and the reason can be 3 different reasons. It can be, in this kid, the struggle is related to reading comprehension. Another kid who looks like they're struggling in the same way, it's attention. And another kid, it's anxiety, that they're so anxious that they can't take in the information. And those interventions will be different for all 3
Right.
kids
And
who
so
look the
isn't it
same.
interesting
Mhm.
that for each of these kids, they all get, 90 minutes a week of RSP.
Yeah.
Like, these children are all different, right?
Mhm.
And so why are they, we shouldn't be limited to the sort of pull down menu,
Right.
that often that's what we're offered in IEPs. And if you're feeling like, you're sort of getting the McDonald's menu for your child,
Mhm.
trust your instincts. That's a great moment to say, I think I need an independent voice here.
Mhm.
I'm going to request that independent evaluation. The only thing to remember about requesting an independent evaluation from your school district
Mhm.
is that, just the way the law is written, if you want the school district to pay for it, you have to let them do it first. You have to
Mhm.
give them the opportunity to assess first.
Mhm. And one of the people on the call said that you can ask for the assessment best to ask in writing. Maybe send an email rather than just verbally telling a teacher that you'd like to request it. Is that correct?
Yeah, actually, that was me.
Oh, that was you.
Chat.
I thought it was Noemi. Oh, you're responding to Noemi. Okay. Okay, that's good. Because
I'm
sometimes
two-timing.
parents will ask verbally and then they will not get a response, or they'll get the, let's do an SST first. So you're
Make
saying
your
it's best to
future
put it in
lawyer
writing.
happy.
Put
Make
it
your
in
future
writing.
lawyer happy and do it in writing.
Okay. I like that. Thank you for putting it in the chat, Heather, and for multitasking. You've got great executive functioning.
Years of practice and therapy.
So I know we've been taking questions all along in the chat, but if there's anyone on the call who has a burning question that hasn't been answered thus far, it seems like this has gone by so quickly. It's like 8:55. Well, 8:55 here. I'm on the East Coast, so it's 5 minutes before we end. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to drop it in the chat, and I will ask our panelists those questions. And if nothing comes up, maybe we can have some closing remarks about, what students need at this time. I think, we've kind of touched on the fact that every student is going to be different in terms of what it is that they need. And we have to be able to know where to get the support that our kids need. And what we want to do is through this town hall and through this discussion is to really let parents know what their options are in terms of seeking support. Whether you're attending a public school or an independent school, it starts with a conversation, and it starts with what I'm hearing from Heather is that you trust your gut in terms of what it is that you're seeing, and sometimes the struggle can look very different. The struggle could be, my child is getting their work done, but this assignment is supposed to take 30 minutes and it took my child 2 hours to do. That also means that there's something different in the way your child is processing the information that is impacting their performance. And that is also something to take a look at. So even if they're getting it done, but they're having to use a lot more energy to get it done, that's something to be mindful of as well.
Oh yeah, especially when you see that increasing, right? 4th grade, 5th grade, 6th grade, because it's not going to get easier. It doesn't go away. Can I say, independent schools, charter schools are public schools, folks. Charter schools are public schools. They have the same legal obligations as every public school. So that's another oh, well, we're a charter, we don't do that. They have to do that. Can I ask Nicole? Nicole, can you speak to one of the questions in the chat about if the student is not 2 grade levels below? So is there something magic about being 2 grade levels below?
No, when we're talking about diagnosing a learning disorder, is that right? No, that there's no rule about that. Right. We look at it when we're considering learning differences. We're looking at, is the student behind in a way that's where they can't keep up with their current grade level, and also having, in addition to that, also having a discrepancy between what they're capable of, so what their potential is, and then what they're achieving. And so that's some of the information that we're able to obtain from a comprehensive evaluation is what is their cognitive ability or their intellectual ability, and then how are they actually performing? And so comparing those, and if there is a discrepancy, that's when we start thinking about learning disorders, or it could be a processing disorder that's impacting their learning. There are so many different things that can be going on.
And, learning disabled kids are smart. They're hella smart.
Absolutely.
Right? I talk to parents every day who say, oh, well, they told me, my child is too smart for an IEP. Or, oh, an IEP wouldn't be right for her because then she'd be in that classroom with, those other kids, and she's smart. No, disabled people are smart. And it's, don't believe anything else. Yes, your child is smart, and quite possibly, yes, your child has a disability and needs accommodations and supports for that.
Right.
Disabled people are smart.
And I think that speaks to the idea that smart kids can need support too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, and kids who get good grades, getting good grades is not an exclusionary factor for qualifying for an IEP.
Right, right. For a
That's,
lot of kids,
yeah,
for a lot of kids, yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
no,
Karen.
please go speak about that.
I was just gonna say, a lot of kids can get good grades or they can stay on grade level because they are working really hard and putting in all these hours. But then we have to think about what is the cost of getting that grade, what's going on behind the scenes. And so when you look at all of that and you see, like, in many cases, how much students struggle to keep up and to be at grade level, that can indicate various difficulties in the way that they process information or in their attention or gaps in their learning that you may not be able to see.
Social emotional, I mean,
Yes.
yeah, there it's a wide spectrum and yeah.
Yeah. And I just want to add one more thing is that we sort of brought up that report cards. I don't think we talked much about it, but I just want to say, in terms of report cards, you know, I think it's something where it can be useful, but we also have to be cautious because during the pandemic, the grading system wasn't the way that it usually is. And so depending on the area or the school district, a lot of schools didn't give grades lower than the child's lowest grade pre-pandemic. Some schools gave pass, no pass grades. Some schools just gave remarks about the students functioning. So we really haven't gotten accurate information. The information we've gotten from teachers has been based on really limited information of what they've seen from the students. So I think it's important to, if there are concerns, for parents to ask questions, like during parent-teacher conferences, like, you know, if they suspect something is wrong, how is my child doing in these subjects? And then if there is a concern with regard to a certain area like reading or writing, asking more specific questions like, what is, you know, what part of reading do you think they're struggling with? Is it reading comprehension? Is it just reading out loud? Like when they're called on to read out aloud in class, is that when they struggle? And just gathering information, I think, not just for the parents to know, but passing it on to, you know, the tutor or the educational therapist or whatever professional is going to work with that child down the line. That's going to be valuable information for parents to have.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really good plan. Yeah. Ask questions. Ask
Absolutely.
big questions.
For some kids, you know, they end up with a low grade, but it's not because they don't know the material, they just haven't turned in the assignments. So that tells you that they know the material, but it might be more of an executive functioning / organizational problem and not like a skills or, you know, learning issue. So asking just follow-up questions about what specifically they're struggling in or what's causing them difficulty within a certain subject can be really illuminating.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think also, I love that you brought up the progress reports from the last academic year, because I think a lot of teachers will say, and teachers were working incredibly hard. I know, you know, that they were working overtime to really meet the demands of students in this, you know, atypical year. But a lot of them will say, I didn't know the kids, you know, they had their videos off, you know, during Zoom, and, you know, I didn't see them. I didn't know, you know, why they weren't getting work done. I don't know their process because I just got the end result. And I don't know how they produced the work that they did, or why they didn't submit the work that they did. And so, you know, it's hard for parents to compare the last academic year to this academic year. So asking lots of questions in terms of, what are you observing in the classroom regarding my child? What are the expectations for a third grader at this point in the academic year? And then not listening to, you know, another parent or someone else saying, well, everybody's behind, so you shouldn't be worried. No, what is the expectation for a third grader at this point in the academic year? Because that's what you should be paying attention to, right? And then how do we get them to where they need to be without causing significant anxiety?
Right.
Right.
Right. Right.
Yeah. So I just want to thank you all. We're a little over time, but this is a great discussion. I feel like we could have probably talked more and more, and maybe we need a part 2. But I hope
We
that
always say that.
we always do. We always do. I think that even like a 504 plan versus an IEP is like its own,
Right.
discussion, and assessments is their own discussion, and educational therapy and what you do during those educational therapy sessions. So I feel like there's more to come, but
Yeah.
I really appreciate your time. Lizeth, Heather, Nicole, thank you for being here. I would love for you to put your email addresses in the chat, Lizeth, Heather, and Nicole. So if anyone wants to follow up with you, they can. Having said that, I will be sending an email to everyone who registered for the webinar, whether or not they were able to attend or not. And I will be giving you the contact information for all of our panelists. And if anyone has follow-up questions, there'll be a way for you to ask those follow-up questions at your leisure. And as you have a chance to meet with teachers and talk about your child, and you have questions and want to know what the next step is, we want to be able to support you and help you as you navigate those next steps. So we will be in touch, and look out for that email, and hopefully you'll join us for another one of our town halls and webinars in the future. If you have ideas for topics of discussion, please send me an email, respond to the email that I'm going to send you tomorrow, and let me know what you want to hear more of. But thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, Karen. These are so much fun.
Yeah,
Thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Everyone.